Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
The news of anti-Semitism in Australia has been increasingly alarming. Today we have as our guest a person who is well positioned to talk about this topic, both from his volunteer position in the Australian Jewish community and his professional position as what in the US is called a trial lawyer. Daniel Aghion is the president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the ECAJ. The ECAJ is the roof representative body of the Jewish community in Australia. Professionally, Daniel is a barrister and King's Counsel. Daniel, welcome to our show, and welcome and thank you for coming on our show at a time that is very different from where we are. What is the time now where you are?
The time, it's 10 o'clock in the morning.
10 o'clock in the morning.
Delighted to be with you both. And I apologize, you might get occasionally a little fella with a tail here, Amber, might pop up because he's on my desk. I apologize.
Okay. Okay, no problem.
Can we start with, Daniel, you're talking about the increases in anti-Semitic incidences in Australia since October 7th. Talk both about the percentages and some examples.
Yes, well, the ECAJ tracks anti-Semitic incidents in Australia, as a number of organisations around the world do for their locations, and we've been doing so for many years. From 7 October to 31 December, end of that calendar year, there was a 738% increase in anti-Semitic incidents compared to the same time in the previous year. Having spoken to some of my colleagues in other places around the world, South Africa, the UK, parts of the US, that's about the same. That is to say that there is a massive increase in anti-Semitism across the globe post 7 October. We are not immune. We in Australia are not immune from it.
Wow. And could you give us some examples of what has happened in the past few months after October 7?
Sure. The incidents we've tracked have been everything from catcalling, calling out names on the street. There's been a couple of minor physical incidents, thankfully nothing serious. So minor assaults. A lot of, as I'm sure it's the same everywhere, a lot of online hate, a lot of very, very nasty material on social media. Probably the one that is, as an example, the one that has troubled us the most, because a lot of that comes from, dare I say, extremists, people who are very noisy, but perhaps who are not influential. The one that has troubled us the most came from a member of Parliament from a group called the Greens, who in Australia, that's a political party that holds about 10% of the vote. They are a left, primarily climate change party, and in that sense, nothing wrong with any of that. But the comment that was made publicly was that the Jewish lobby uses its tentacles to extend its influence into other ethnic community groups and places of power. She was called on it. She later apologised, but the apology was very wishy-washy. Oh, well, I was very upset about what was happening in the Middle East, and and we've got to be, and so forth and so forth. But that's probably been the most concerning one in terms of a person of influence. That is to say, a parliamentarian saying it, as opposed to some mad person on social media.
Right, where criticism of Israel crossed the line of anti-Semitism using classical anti-Semitic tropes like the Jews have the world under control.
Well, it's interesting. We didn't even see it in that way as that criticism of Israel crossing the line into anti-Semitism, because it was an express reference to the Jewish lobby.
Oh, yeah.
And it said the Jewish lobby had its tentacles, was using its tentacles to influence power. So you're right, it was that classic trope. It was contemporaneous in time with the post-7 October events, and clearly the statement was triggered by it. But the content of the statement wasn't that, well, criticism of Israel moving over into anti-Semitic behaviour, at least from our perspective.
And how is it on Australian campuses?
Campuses,
University campuses.
Yes, university campuses. Look, it's not good. Same as everywhere else. University campuses are as always, as they should be, a hotbed of free speech. And the trouble with that is that allows speech which sometimes is extreme. You have a lot of very aggressive pro-Palestinian support. And again, while there's nothing wrong with supporting people in Gaza, if that is your view, it's exactly as you said, Evelyn, that crossing of the line into anti-Semitic behaviour and some of the aggression about it and the consequent feeling of lack of safety for Jewish students on campus. The response has been varied. Some of the university administrators, a small number, have been excellent. They've made it clear that Hamas is proscribed as a terrorist organisation by the Australian government. And if you are going to support Hamas in any way, then you would be supporting terror, and that will not be tolerated on campus. And so a small number of campuses have been excellent. Most campus administrators, vice-chancellors and similar, have been either indifferent, well, that's a matter of just student politics, or they have made it a point that there is something here known as the French Code, named after a retired judge who coordinated and implemented it, which is a free speech code on universities. And what they've said is, well, the French Code means that we will not interfere in matters of free speech by students or by lecturers, and therefore we will not get involved.
So even if it's anti-Semitic, they are bound by that code not to interfere?
No, the code wouldn't permit anti-Semitic speech, but it's exactly as you said earlier, Evelyn, that question of crossing the line. And we're finding that administrators are very reluctant to get involved in the question of when the line is crossed.
Okay.
Well, we just talked about 2 cancellations of speakers in Australia. Were those on college campuses or were they in public venues?
No, they were, private venues, but they were not campuses. So one cancellation was, the irony, it was a mental health conference. So a conference of mental health professionals. There was a leading Israeli mental health professional who was going to come and speak about mental health arising from war trauma. He's as I say, internationally renowned, and his invitation was cancelled at the last minute, allegedly because the organisers were inundated with inundated with threats and abuse, and they cancelled it, quote unquote, for his own safety. The conference went ahead, but the conference went ahead without the Israeli specialist. The second one was a pair of Israeli comedians who were going to do their act at a cinema in a medium-sized chain, and the cinema owner cancelled their appearance. They then went and appeared at a rival chain.
What was the reason given for cancelling the appearance?
2 reasons. One, sensitivity of the occasion, and the second, again, this question of security. It is an issue we're facing here, and again, I haven't spoken to my colleagues around the world about this. I'm sure it's similar. It's leading into this notion of the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions approach. when these invitations are long-standing, pre 7 October, but when activist pro-Palestinian groups hear about an Israeli, regardless of that person's views on the Middle East conflict, but an Israeli going to speak or do something somewhere, all of a sudden the organisers of whatever event it is get absolutely bombarded with vile material, and your average organiser of an event here who just wants to have a good event, you can imagine, sort of reacts and says, oh my gosh, what have I got here? And their instinctive response is, well, I'll solve the problem by removing the person being complained about. So it's not that the organisers are anti-Semitic, or that the organisers have a particular view about Israel or Gaza. It's that they are being pressured into taking a decision to just get out of it by removing the Israeli person from the equation. So it's BDS by
intimidation.
By intimidation, BDS by intimidation and coercion. Correct.
Right, and that's what we've heard several times over the past weeks from other guests from other parts of the world as well, where they spoke about cancellation of speakers or performers or academics merely because they are Israeli or Zionist, and the method used is intimidation, and that is something I think the Jewish community worldwide is up against, and I hope we will find an answer to that. I understand a theater or a university that doesn't want to take security risks. They're not specialized in protecting the audience and the artists or the speakers against violence, but so I understand that they're intimidated by it and call it off. But we have to find an answer to this as a society, because coercion and intimidation, of course, is not a legitimate method to use in the world of free speech. So this rising anti-Semitism since October 7, from which part of society in Australia is it coming mostly? Well,
It's coming from all areas, all of the traditional areas, if I can put it that way. It's always interesting. People talk about where does it come from, and the short answer is, we Jews always get it. So at the moment, I would say the predominant area is the extreme left, the militant activist, sort of socialist type left, who talk about Israel in the language of a colonial oppressive power, and sort of tie the tragedy in Gaza in terms of the deaths of the civilians and the responsibility for all of that. Instead of laying it at the feet of Hamas, they talk about 75 years of oppression and lay it at the feet of the Western world for creating these kinds of oppression of Indigenous rights as they perceive it. So a lot of it comes from the extreme left. We have some from the Muslim community, particularly from some of the imams are making speeches in mosques that are inciting. So there's that as well. And then, of course, as always happens, the neo-Nazis, they see an opportunity, so they climb in as well. And certainly there's been a couple of neo-Nazi marches in Australia, thankfully very, very small numbers, in the order of about 20 or 30. But most of it is coming from the extreme left at the moment.
I see.
Did you mean 20 or 30 people marching, or 20 or 30 marches?
No, 20 or 30 people marching.
Oh, okay, got it.
Thankfully, our neo-Nazis are very, very small. They're very public, and when they do something public, they are condemned by all of society, not just the Jews. But they see an opportunity, so of course they be as public as they can.
Right. What has been the government response in Australia to increases in anti-Semitic incidents?
The government response has been twofold. First of all, thankfully, they are reviewing their racial abuse laws. We have racial abuse laws here, but they are very weak. And it's very, very hard to get things done under those racial abuse laws. There's the ability to take action privately, but the ability to take for the government to take criminal action is virtually nil, even though it technically exists. So the government is reviewing the racial abuse laws so that if there is abusive behaviour, not physical behaviour, but abusive conduct, that would be better able to be enforced as criminal behaviour. The second thing is that the government here is talking a lot about social cohesion and damage to social cohesion. So they are trying to, again, in the language of the government here, reduce the temperature. And they're trying to distinguish between the views one might have about Israel and Gaza on the one hand, and the impact here upon communities here. So there is some leadership from government on that. One of the difficulties we're finding is that every single time they reference anti-Semitism, they have the words anti-Islamophobia. And so it's always, everybody must stay calm, behave, we condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And while Islamophobia, of course, should be condemned, and I would stand with anybody to condemn it, the sources of anti-Semitism and the sources of Islamophobia are different. And the way in which they ought be combated are different. So we do have an issue with the government sort of lumping them all together and just saying, well, everybody needs to behave because you should all, this is not what we do in Australia, and we condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Is that driven, that lumping together by the Australian government, is that driven by a fear of calling out anti-Semitism separately and on its own, a fear for a reaction from the Muslim community on that?
Yes, it is. It's a fear of being seen to take a side.
Right.
And to support, if you like, one community against another.
Right.
And the difficulty, of course, with that is it's not a question of one community against another, because both should be condemned, both should be dealt with and removed as far as possible from society, but in different ways. It's not one or the other. Right.
So how big is the Muslim community in Australia? By and large?
I don't know exactly. I imagine I may be proven wrong by census figures, but I'm going to say probably about somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people.
On the population?
So in percentage terms.
And the total population?
Total population is 25 million. So I'm going to say we're probably talking about between 1% and 2% of the population.
Okay, and how many Jews? How big is the Jewish community?
About half of 1%.
Okay.
Congregated in the two main cities where Jews are found are Melbourne and Sydney. There are smaller communities in other cities. So in the two main cities, it would get closer to between 1% and 2% of the city population. But across the country, about half of 1%.
Okay.
Let's talk about, and I'd like you to define what the word means also, the doxing of Jewish community members who support Israel. And I understand there is a proposal for national anti-doxing laws in Australia. So as a lawyer, would you like to explain this?
Sure. So we've had quite a public issue that has occupied the front pages of the newspapers for many days. As a result of 7 October, as you could imagine, a lot of Jewish people have gathered, including in online spaces, to say, well, what can we do? And there was one particular group that was established. They called themselves Creatives for Israel. And essentially they were Jewish people working in the arts and entertainment industries in various ways. And there were about 600 of them in this WhatsApp group that was formed organically. And they were just exchanging thoughts and ideas and comments and support for each other. Interestingly, not all of them would be said to be Zionists. Some of them were quite indifferent. Some of them were horrified by what Israel was doing. In other words, their views were irrelevant. The commonality was that they were Jews working in the arts and entertainment space. The content of that WhatsApp was leaked in its entirety and became public, as a result of which some pro-Palestinian activists started collating various information about the members of the group, their email addresses, if they were employed, the name of their employer and their immediate supervisor. If they could find a photograph of them online, they would add that to the spreadsheet and would collate as much personal information about these people as they could. And that spreadsheet was then distributed publicly, obviously with an invitation to attack and abuse these people. And that's exactly what happened. Entertainers had contracts cancelled. One person was a member of a band and the other band members threw them out of a band. One person was dismissed from their employment and so on and so on and so on. There's all kinds of consequences that have resulted for these people. So the government thankfully quickly announced that they would, so this is online, I think this is called doxing.
Yes.
Where you gather private information about a person for malicious purposes and you distribute that to the wider public because you want the wider public to attack the person because of their beliefs. And as I say, on this occasion, not necessarily because of their beliefs, but on this occasion, just simply because they were Jews. It harkens back, of course, to, it's not anywhere near as severe, but the notion of keeping Jewish lists. The government thankfully stepped in very quickly and has announced that they are going to amend their privacy legislation and they're going to bring in anti-doxing laws. I'm not certain, but I believe it may be one of the first times in the world that this legislation will be enacted. There is a limited form of legislation in Washington State, in the US. If it exists elsewhere in the world, I'm not aware of it. Certainly, the government, thankfully, will be a leader and a proactive leader on this, the Australian government, and they're going to make it a crime to publish private or personal information for malicious purposes without that person's consent. We're currently in discussion with the government as to what that law will look like. So I don't know the final form of it, but that's the concept that has been announced. And by the sound of it, it will be brought out very quickly. And thankfully, we have two major parties in this country. And thankfully, the opposition, who has been very, very, I've got to say, the opposition here, the Liberal Party, has been very, very supportive of our community and of Israel, but specifically of our community. I anticipate that the opposition will provide strong support for that proposed legislation, and it will therefore pass through the Parliament.
Definitely needed elsewhere. I was with someone once when she found out that she was doxxed in Boston, that Jewish names were in addresses, and she was very frightened. I mean, it's really terrifying. So I did read about this, that Australia was going to respond, and I mean, if that law passes, I really hope other countries around the world will follow suit.
Look, it's wonderful that the law is being passed, but the terrible thing about it is that the reason it had to be even considered in the first place, that merely for being a Jew and working in the arts and entertainment industry, that because of that, you were on a list of people which was then made public, information collated about it, and then that information used to attack you. That cannot be acceptable behaviour on any view of the world, and it comes back to simply because these people are Jewish.
Yeah, it's terrible. What was there? Was this a person or an organization who was behind the doxing? Do we know anything about that?
So it seems to be a number of pro-Palestinian activists. Some have selectively done this. There is one name that I'll mention because it's been very much in the paper. There is a very strong feminist activist in Australia by the name of Clementine Ford, and she has a supporter base online of about quite large, international, of about 250,000 people. And I don't know whether she was involved in the collation of the material. That hasn't been suggested, but certainly she was involved in the distribution of it.
Wow.
She has, you know, so it's not any particular organisation that can be identified as doing this. It's more, as best as we can tell, a number of individuals that either individually or collectively have started collating this information and then distributing it.
Yeah. It's scary, and it's also strange to hear that somebody who fights, a feminist who fights discrimination of women, is so discriminating Jews, another minority.
As I've seen a lot of her material and online, which in my view is vile. It comes from she's very, very militantly pro-Palestinian. So in her view of the world, the Israel Defense Forces are baby murderers, and therefore essentially anybody that has anything to do with Israel is fair game in whatever manner one can identify on whatever manner one can adopt online. The problem, of course, is you know, as we've discussed earlier, there's a difference between criticism of Israeli government or military policy, perfectly acceptable, and crossing the line into behaviour that is anti-Semitic. And it's exactly because of that crossing of the line that it has prompted the government to implement these anti-doxing laws.
Yeah.
I take it she's absolutely silent what Hamas did to civilians and babies and the rape, etc. on October 7th. It's as if that didn't exist.
I don't know, in the sense of I haven't seen all of her material, so I don't know what she said immediately after 7 October. You'd have to ask, you know, it'd be a very interesting question to ask of her, isn't it? When rape is used as a weapon of terror, as we know it was on the 7th of October, why isn't that called out as a matter of, as it should be, as a matter of, well, women's rights, and also a question of as a simple matter of humanity?
Evelyn?
What is the Australian Jewish community's overall plan to reduce anti-Semitism?
Well, it's something it's something we've been grappling with for a long time, but obviously it's gained far greater urgency post 7 October. In terms of people who are rabid anti-Semites, who are going to criticise Jews for being Jews, my view has always been that you can criminalise that behaviour, but you're not going to change that person's thinking. De-radicalisation is a very, very intensive process and not likely to work. But a lot of the anti-Semitism that we see in Australia is unthinking anti-Semitism. It arises because of the ignorance. As mentioned, we're a very small part proportionately of the community, and your average Australian probably has never met a Jew, or if they have, they didn't realise that the person was Jewish because they're not wearing a kippah, they don't have the they don't have a payot, they don't present as the stereotypical Brooklyn, New York Jew that we see on in the American films. So what we are doing is we are developing an anti-Semitism training program for schools, and we're going to. Our intent is to pilot it in the state of Western Australia with the government-owned schools, and you need to understand that in Australia, probably about 70% of students go to government schools, and the aim is to get that program into the schools so that the kids get to learn who is a Jew. So you can, if you like, see and feel and touch a Jew, and you discover that, first of all, we don't have horns. We don't have a tail. We're human beings. We're real, and we have an interesting culture. We have fantastic food, and it's actually quite interesting to learn about another culture, be it Jewish or be it other. And if they have that kind of learning inculcated into a program within the school, the intention, of course, is that those kids will grow up to be far more tolerant human beings. So it's a very, very long-term approach, but it's one that is aimed at combating ignorant anti-Semitism, that ignorance having been created by lack of knowledge of the other. If that pilot...
I was just going to say, Daniel told me ahead of time, and I'd like him to just pause for a minute and explain where Holocaust education is mandated and why this is different than Holocaust education.
Yeah. So in some states in Australia, we have 6 states and 2 territories, equivalent to provinces or states or cantons in other countries. In some states in Australia, Holocaust education is mandatory. And so they'll learn about, they'll learn about the horrors of the Holocaust. They'll visit the Holocaust Museum in their state. And that is an important component. But that's a very specific thing. That's learning about the horrors that can be, that humans can do to other humans in the context of a Holocaust. It doesn't really teach them about what is a Jew. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of actually meeting a Jew and finding out that Jews are human beings and you can interact with them, and you should, and it's a great thing to do. So anti-Semitism training is different in that sense from Holocaust training. It's the reason we're going to do it in Western Australia, because Holocaust training is not mandated there. So we're going into that state with a blank slate. And we're going to put the anti-Semitism training program in place. If that is rolled out successfully, then our intention is to then roll it out across the country to the extent that the state governments will come on board.
Daniel, I have a question about the training program for schools where you explain what a Jew is and what a Jew is not. How does that... You said the anti-Semitism today is coming mainly from the far left, which is very ideological. It has everything to do with Israel, Zionism, not acknowledging the right of the Jewish people of their own state, and not acknowledging the historical the historical ties of the Jewish people to Israel. So how are you addressing that with a program that is talking about what is a Jew and what we don't grow horns?
Yes, in the sense that, yes, it will be part of it, because obviously the issue, I think, is this. The word Zionism is being weaponized against us. Mm-hmm. Zionism is a bad thing, so it is said, because it's a militarist ideology. It's an oppressive ideology. And you sort of think back to the odious United Nations resolution that Zionism is racism. And it took, was it 20 years to get that off the books of the United Nations. But this reincarnation of it is the same concept. And it's the thing is that I'm a Zionist. And as a Zionist, to me, what that means is that my mother was born in Israel, in Rehovot. I have an affiliation with Israel because of that familial descendancy, but also because of my connection to the community. It's our homeland. It's our place of refuge that was created for us. It's the modern miracle that was created post World War II. It is, and in that sense, if I meet an Indian person in the street, and that person tells me that they went to the cricket's very big in Australia, and they went to the cricket match and they cheered for India versus Australia, I'd have a wonderful chat with them about how the Indian cricketers performed and the big Indian cricket players, and I would be delighted that an Indian Australian would go along and cheer for the Indian side so that the Indian team would have support here. It's that notion of connection to homeland that defines Zionism for me, and I would have thought for most Zionists, rather than the perverted or weaponized version that is being used against us. So there is, yes, that would be part of a training. There has to be, I think, there's a separate question, which you're raising, Evelyn, which is really not so much at the school level, but more in terms of these left organisations. There has to be an understanding that there is a difference between criticism of Israel, for which there can be no complaint. I mean, I don't agree with everything that the Israeli government does or the Israeli military does. I certainly do not. And singling out Israel for special treatment. That's a separate. You asked. That's a separate program we've got. We've been trying to build on the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and we've been trying, where possible, to get that implemented. We have it implemented in government, and the opposition have also said they support it. We've gotten it progressively into some local councils, some universities, but not many. So that's a separate project to try and build that into the policy of organisations that regulate or speak in this area. I don't think we'll ever win over the extreme leftists, but I think all we can do is just continue to make that point.
Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of this really interesting interview. And if you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with the audience, please do.
If you have a little time, I'll tell a quick story. I was on a train on the morning, it would have been Wednesday morning after 7 October. So late Tuesday, Israel time. All anybody knew at that stage, including within Israel, was that there had been a mass attack. Many people had died. Many people had been taken hostage. Nobody knew the numbers. The IDF was still trying to secure Israel's borders. It was still an active terrorist incident within Israel. And there I was on the train, going into work in suburban, going into the central business district of Melbourne. And on the other side of the train, there were two people, and they were talking loud enough for me to hear and others. And one said, and keep in mind, there'd been no question of Israel going into Gaza. None of that had been discussed. It was just simply a terrorist incident, and a massive one. And one said on the other side of the train, one said to the other, well, Israel got everything it deserved. The other one agreed. And the first one said, the US will come in and help them as they always do, but that's because Jews control all of the money. And I thought, there it is. I am on a train in peak hour in a city of 5 million people in a Western democracy. A massive terrorist incident has occurred. In Israeli terms, by population, greater in scale than 9/11. And that was the immediate response by some people speaking openly in a public environment, a reversion to those classic anti-Semitic tropes. We deserve it because we control the world. Well, if I could control the world, I could tell you those people wouldn't have said what they were saying or been able to.
If we controlled the world, there wouldn't have been the massacre.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're fighting. We're fighting these deep-seated, deep-rooted beliefs, but at times of high impact and high stress, such as 7 October, they are revealed. Those people would, they'd say it quietly over a beer to each other when no one else, in a pub when no one else is listening, but post 7 October, they'll happily say it openly and loudly on a train.
Yes. And that's why all of us have to work even harder to combat this. So Daniel, we thank you so much. We thank you so much as a leader in the Australian Jewish community, what you're doing. It must be you have small children and you're a lawyer, and yet you're doing all this. So we really appreciate what you do. We thank our listeners for listening. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And as we end every episode, we say, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.